Golden Gauntlet World Championship Qualifier 2 starts tomorrow, and these are the decks that have me most excited that good players are taking to it. We're going to start with probably the most interesting development, which is that a lot of really good players that I respect ended up taking some form of Juggernaut Cosmo move-based mid-range instead of the expected Surfer Captain Carter kind of combo choice. And a lot of this is because they believe that this deck has similar power output to those decks, but also is much better at dealing with counterplay, and that Juggernaut and Cosmo, as long as you take priority against those decks, give you a pretty good matchup against the expected best deck in the field. When I've played this deck, it feels a little finicky. There's a little bit of I need to actually make sure that I'm doing something, and I'm leaning pretty heavily on Juggernaut Cosmo in those games where I'm not comboing off heavily and I'm just getting a couple of 9 power multiple men. But largely, one of the things that this deck does particularly well is just be in every game that it plays. There are a ton of ways for this deck to sort of backdoor its way into a winning position, thanks to being a Juggernaut Cosmo deck, and thanks to the fact that it has so many cheap ways to get a ton of power. There's a ton of things to think about when you play a deck like this, but multiple players, not just the two I've listed, Browday as well, are on this list in an attempt to sort of go over the top of everything else and expecting, I believe, a reasonable amount of not just the Captain Carter combo deck, but of people playing Shadow King to beat the Captain Carter combo deck. So they get to rock up here with a green power deck that is protected from Shadow King, that they think is favored into the Captain Carter combo deck, which seems like a really compelling thing to do. One of my big worries if I were playing this deck is just stamina. It's going to be a pretty long tournament, and this is a difficult deck. There are not as many free wins in a deck like this as there are in the Surfer deck or the Captain Carter combo deck, and that I need to remember to keep calling it that in the right way. That deck has tons of absolutely free wins and tons of matchups that are just incredibly favored. Things like Techno-Organic Virus and basically every deck playing Venus, you just feel very good into. And this deck doesn't have nearly as many free matchups, but if you really master it and understand what you're trying to do, there's a lot of good ones. In a sort of twist on that, Iris is taking a Batroc shell that is going to be doing a similar thing. There is, of course, the Juggernaut Cosmo that you see fairly commonly in these lists, but also you do have access to things like Thing First Steps to try to blow up opposing Captain Carters, get things out of that location, generally mess up what is a fairly straightforward but still relatively easy to disrupt combo deck in the Captain Carter combo list, and then have a bunch of just baseline good mid-range stats. The other thing that this deck is benefiting from is the recent nerf to Gambit. Not that that means that Gambit, Horseman of Death, is unplayable or anything, but there's a lot less of it running around because of that nerf. And in addition, this is also a deck that benefits from the relative removal of Killmonger from a lot of decks. There were people playing Killmonger in the Captain Carter decks to try to beat the TOV stuff. Now with Stick, you don't even need to do that. You just beat the TOV stuff by virtue of doing more points than them. So there's a lot less Killmonger in this field. Phantom X kind of fell off for reasons that are still actually a little unclear to me, and that could be like a space that is worth watching in the future. And that was another deck that was playing a ton of Killmonger, and now that there's less Killmonger, and we've established that like Juggernaut Cosmo is a pretty reasonable thing to be doing with priority into the Captain Carter decks, you end up with a deck that actually has a pretty decent amount of equity. What I'm really interested to see, though, is whether the more combo-based move with the multiple man Human Torch Iska stuff, or the more mid-range based move like this is going to come out on top. While we're here, I wanted to give a shout out to ELA. There was a Reddit post recently that was like, we should gaslight the competitive community into playing this deck, and it was just a deck of 12 Series 5 cards so that the pack that for the last couple Golden Gauntlets, when they've had a winner, they've done like a featured pack. And so the last time the featured pack was W's Supergiant deck, which everyone basically already had the cards for. So they were like, what if we convinced people to do the opposite, right? What if we convinced people to do the opposite and we just had a pack that was like all expensive cards that people actually wanted? And this is ELA's attempt to deliver on that. So if you guys want to thank anyone, you should thank him if he manages to pull it out. This is purely an attempt at gaming the system. This is a deck that he brought basically specifically to say, if I win, there's going to be a really sick pack on sale. Enjoy that, everybody. And I just wanted to highlight that. Rabbit Sweet is a really good player who is consistently performing well, both in these tournaments and on ladder. A little bit more unknown probably to my audience because he plays on the Asia server and mostly creates content in a language that is foreign to the majority of my audience, presumably. But a really good player who is known for playing pretty consistently good decks, someone who I tend to look for when I'm looking through standings to be like, oh, okay, let's see what this person is doing. And I find this pretty compelling. Like, obviously, it's the Surfer deck. Obviously, it's the Venus version of the Surfer deck. It's like actually a Surfer deck that's a little less of a full combo deck. What I'm interested to see is how this holds up in a world where other people might be playing the Storm stuff. Because I do think the Storm stuff is like a little bit better in a general sense. But you could talk me into just having more good draws is a valuable thing in a Conquest game mode. I'm not particularly sure, but I am interested to see how this one plays out because this is a really good player taking a really good deck. Like, if you put a gun to my head, I would say this is the second best deck in the game, only behind the other version of the Captain Carter combo deck. One thing that I am interested in, though, is that I've seen some players messing around with Galactus in the Carter combo deck as a sort of mirror piece of tech, and I think that that could come into play in a tournament like this, and this deck does notably lack that. But I do think that this is a deck that people, A, are expecting, and B, are aware of. And so taking it to a tournament like this is a bold statement where it's like, I expect all of you to have a target on my back, and I'm just going to play through it anyway. And there's an argument that being a surfer-y kind of deck gives you a little more equity into that kind of stuff if you're able to manipulate priority well so that you can or back buffing of locations and have more confusing final turns. And I think that that's really the interesting thing to me when it comes to the differences between this and the Storm deck. The Storm deck is going to output power more, but this deck might be able to lie about where that power is in close games a little bit better. And I'm really interested to see if that bears out. When I talk about the target on the back of the Captain Carter combo deck, this kind of thing is a lot of what I'm talking about. Now, I've been doing Invisible Woman and Shadow King and Grandmaster in not just this deck, but also in Techno-Organic Virus a little bit recently. But Sizer's the person who really reminded me that Invisible Woman exists and that it is a viable option to try to beat this Surfer stuff, this Captain Carter stuff, whatever it is you want to do. You are going to go over the top of them in that matchup if you're able to set up the Invisible Woman stuff. It's a very powerful strategy that is reasonably a great plan in that specific matchup, and then you just rely on the fact that you have a functioning deck in every other matchup and you're just probably going to be fine there is kind of the theory here. One of the things that the Cosmo Juggernaut decks are pretty good against, specifically the Cosmo part of it, the Juggernaut's a lot worse against this, but specifically Cosmo is really good against this kind of stuff. So that matchup might be a little bit interesting if he comes up against the Iris deck or the deck that Honifer and Browday are playing. Those are going to be some really interesting things here, but I think that this is sort of just level one. I would like to beat the Captain Carter deck. I see the base version of the Captain Carter deck. I would like to have a line in my deck that they literally cannot beat. And that is the basic premise here. The other thing that's interesting here is that Sizer is playing a Hope Summers in an attempt to alleviate a weakness to Mobius, because in as much as this deck is part of a metagame trifecta, whenever I play the Carter deck, I feel like I basically cannot lose the TOV. When I play this deck, it's like, okay, I'm pretty favored into the Carter deck, but I can lose to TOV again. And I think that that's sort of where he's aiming here, because this deck gets hurt pretty badly by a Mobius M Mobius, and that is a way of alleviating some of the pressure there and just getting your output onto the board so you can actually compete with them on points and do what you need to do. Cougar is taking his patented Dakin combo list. He's been playing this list a lot recently, and it's a list that, like, I think probably should have made a few more of my videos of like, here's some off-meta decks. But the thing that's always hurt me is whenever I go to cross-check it, right? I don't just put any list a top player sends me on here. I go to like check. I'm like, okay, does this make sense to me? What is it actually doing? Is there a real ethos here? And then I check, you know, some public trackers and see how people are performing with it. And if there's like a huge delta, that's usually a concerning thing. And this is one of the lists that has had the biggest delta between what Cougar tells me it can do and what people actually seem to do when they play it. And it's hard for me to square that because obviously, like, maybe it's a particularly compelling and difficult deck to play. Maybe that's all true. Or maybe Cougar's just really good and he's skill diffing people, and that makes it difficult to figure out. I'm really interested to see how this deck specifically does because I think I'll get a lot of answers to that question. My biggest worry for this deck is that it's not actually going to be good enough at doing points to be worth trying to be like, if I'm going to be a Mother Askani deck or whatever, why would I be doing my copies in the Dakin space when I could be doing my copies in a different space, right? If people are already doing this like invisible woman Shadow King stuff, that's going to beat me by default because all my stuff is just going to be happening before that. And the real upside of being a Dakin deck is the ability to throw priority and dodge normal Shadow Kings, but that's actually something that the Surfer deck can already do. And so you're just sort of in a situation where I'm not convinced this deck has a fundamental ethos for it should be a thing that you're doing, but Cougar's had a ton of success with it, and I think putting that to the test in the Golden Gauntlet tournament will be really interesting. Fudge top forward my KMBest block party with this list that he refers to as AI Hella or AI Strife, depending on how it is, because it's, it's artificial intelligence, it's Agatha intelligence even. This is a fairly straightforward, just I'm going to do something stupid and try to combo you off list. It is a list that can play through a Stardust better than some other Hella lists because it is able to do this combo stuff, but frankly, it's still mostly losing to Stardust. This is a deck that has some interesting metagame dynamics going for it, which is to say, I don't think you beat the Carter decks basically ever, but a lot of the stuff that's trying to beat the Carter decks, you go over the top of and they have absolutely nothing for you. Like, it feels like this is a deck that's just going to play a bunch of non-games over the course of the day where they're just decided in deck building by like, am I going bigger than you or do I have a Stardust? And then if the answer to those questions is no, this is probably just winning. And I think that's a really interesting choice for a tournament like this because you're basically just taking a gamble on matchup odds. And like, yeah, maybe you'll be able to skill it out. Fudge beat a couple of RHM Stardusts in my tournament. He's a really good player. And I think that there's definitely some upside in choosing to do this. But it is two questions that you're going to be asking that I'm not sure I want the answer to those questions, right? Like, how many people are playing a deck that goes over the top of this? Everyone who's playing Carter, probably. How many people are playing Stardust? Well, I think a lot of people who are trying to beat Carter are playing Stardust, and I don't think it works, but I think they're doing it, and that could be bad for this deck. Flat actually innovated the Sarah Onslaught Magic Dump All Your Threes deck way back in the day, and he's returning to his old tricks, even though it is a lot lower upside to do what this deck is doing nowadays. This was a deck that really benefited from how Onslaught used to scale, because one of the big strengths of this deck was that you were able to do a lot of things with making sure that you have, a Mr. Fantastic, an Onslaught, Prodigy the Onslaught, a Mystique It, a bunch of stuff, just 100 points in both lanes. If we were still able to do that, I think this deck would be like a really legitimate choice. As is, I think it's much more like I am going to Shadow King you and then combo off with a Moonstone in another lane. And the premise in the matchup against the Captain Carter stuff is pretty much that. And the premise in the matchup against anything else is I'm just going to do enough multipliers that I'm going to have more points than you. One of the really worrying things for this deck for me, though, and I don't really know another way to say this, is I've played the Carter deck against Iron Man decks and won. Like, I've played those games where it's like they have I played a game where they had 3 Iron Men off of an ancient one, and I won that lane. The numbers the Carter deck can get to on the top end are really, really ridiculous, and you're kind of priced into snapping a lot of the time. And I think that there's some real worry as to how that is going to go down. This deck, if they hadn't changed Onslaught, I think would actually be a deck I could reasonably call like, this is kind of hidden OP. Like, this is really sick when it works. As is, I think the output's just a little bit lower than where I would want it to be, but it is a really surprising deck that people will not know how to play against in a meaningful way, and also will definitely lose to anyone playing Mobius, which unfortunately is everyone playing TOV. Speaking of Techno-Organic Virus, Andre Var won my KMBest Block Party tournament with a 4-piece of tech version of Techno-Organic Virus, and in this tournament, he has simply added another piece of tech, that is Cosmic Ghost Rider. This is the tech slop of the metagame, but I kind of love where it's positioned right now. Like, I am always a sucker for like a nice little mid-range deck that does nice little mid-range things. And I got to tell you, you kind of need all of this. You need all of this to beat the Captain Carter deck, and being able to actually flip that matchup. If he actually feels confident in that matchup, that's such a huge deal. That's so important if that matchup is actually good, that you can actually do things that win. And I think the Cosmic Ghost Rider goes a long way towards shoring up that matchup, even if it doesn't make a ton of sense in this list. Just having a plan for it is really important, because when I play on ladder and my opponent plays like a Martyr or a Shadowlands Daredevil and I'm playing Carter combo, I'm just snapping because they just don't have anything for me. And I think that this is a version of the list where it's like, I don't care if they Mobius me or if they Shadow King me or if they Stardust me. None of that really matters to me. What matters to me is a Cosmic Ghost Rider. That would actually matter to me. That would actually hurt me. That would actually prevent me from snapping if I knew they had a Cosmic Ghost Rider. And I think that this is as smart as it gets for playing TOV in this tournament. Like, this is, to me, the best list of TOV you could possibly play. But if you run into other TOV decks that are doing bigger stuff than you, I don't know how you beat them, because so many of these slots are devoted to tech. So I think what's going on here is Andre Var is saying, I'm going to be fully prepared for everything my opponent is going to do. I'm going to be the Sarah control of the metagame. And if I run into like the other people playing TOV, I'm just going to have to skill diff them. I'm just going to have to be better and trust myself as a good player to allocate my points more efficiently and better than they are. And I'm just going to have to do that to make this make sense. Because if I didn't do that, then I don't think I could bring TOV. That's sort of what I think of when I see this list and sort of consider what thought might have gone into it. There are certain players on ladder, Andre Var is one of them, who just have deck building sensibilities that are super similar to my own, where it's like, whenever you can play like this sort of low to the ground mid-rangey tech pile, do it, even if it's just not the best thing to be doing. Putting all your sort of stat points into that is a really useful thing to do. Andre Var is one of them, Shamo's another. And this is just a mid-range gamer right here. That's what he does. He does mid-range stuff. And here we have a Supergiant list that is built to be weird. This is a list that people will not have a lot of experience playing against. Clog is notably pretty good against the Carter stuff. Supergiant is notably pretty good against the Carter stuff. There's a lot of good stats plays in here. There's a lot of interesting tech. There's a lot of cool things going on that I think people are going to be unfamiliar with. This is taking an angle on the metagame that people are not prepared to deal with, that is low power but high on disruption. If that disruption lines up, I'm really interested how this ends up going. One of the things that I think is really interesting for me is this list going to hold up against TOV stuff? Are we confident in that matchup? Are we able to win it? Because whenever I play a Supergiant list, my biggest enemy is just whatever the other people playing mid-range decks are doing, because I'm probably going to be a little lighter on points and it's going to take a lot of work for me to make that happen. So that matchup to me feels like the one that's the key here. Last up from Gamer, it's Sugiless Sugi. Gamer is a Supergiant one-trick who is now turning to Invisible Woman as a cheaper way of delaying his tech if he needs to do it. This is a list that is just going for pure mid-range stats with the interaction necessary between Supergiant, or not Supergiant, between Invisible Woman and Shadow King, and then Cosmo, to just sort of prevent your opponents from being able to output all the things they want to output, and a classic, straightforward tech kind of build from Gamer here. Again, though, I do think there is a notable worry of TOV, and you can see that Gamer's also a little concerned with that with the Electra. One of the interesting things about this deck, though, is the inclusion of Scarlet Witch, because I think that the combination of Scarlet Witch and Invisible Woman is actually a little bit awkward. If you play the Invisible Woman out at basically any time, they can magic that lane. You won't be able to Scarlet Witch it. And I think that's like a pretty awkward position to put yourself in, for sure. And it might be the kind of dynamic that we see come up during the games. But largely, this is a list that is saying, I need more points. It's looking at the Supergiant deck and it's saying, I'm not confident in the TOV matchup. I need to have more points in the deck. I need to have Electra to make sure that I'm blowing up a demon or whatever. I'm going to put points on the board, but I need to make sure that I'm also meaningfully interfering with them. So in as much as this is still a deck in the TOV space, it's a deck that I think needs to concern itself with that matchup as well. And it's trying to sort of square the circle of how do I just have good matchups against basically anything I run into. That's another thing Gamer does a lot of. He's kind of also in that mid-range guy that I pay attention to camp. And I think this is a really interesting direction for him to go. One of the side note, by the way, if you look on the website that we run these tournaments on, he named this deck Hella, which is just solid bluff, my man. All right, yo, thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. Golden Gauntlet tournament starts at 11 a.m. Eastern tomorrow, Saturday. I will hopefully be co-streaming it, and then I will also be doing live the commentary on the top 4 in the tournament. So please do check it out. It's going to be super dope. There's drops still going, so it should be a great time. Thank you so much for watching. I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal, and I'll see you in the next one.